Good afternoon, class.
Good afternoon, teacher.
This is our fifth lecture in the course of selected readings in British and American poetry. I'll talk about William Wordsworth, a 19th century British romantic poet. And my topic is emotion, recollected in tranquility. I will start with a brief introduction to the life of William Wordsworth and his lyrical ballads. And then we'll talk about, his definition, Wordsworth's definition of poetry, before we have a close reading of his poem, I Wander Lonely as a Cloud. This is Wordsworth's definition of poetry. Poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The definition sounds as if the two parts are in contradiction to each other, but actually they are not. I will use this poem, I Wander Lonely as a Cloud, as an example to illustrate Wordsworth's famous definition of poetry. Now let me read aloud the poem for you. I wander lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw the crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. William Wordsworth was born in a small village in the Lake District. His family was very well off. They lived, as you can see here, in a stately home near the most beautiful of all rivers, the Derwent River. He was sent to a grammar school, and he stayed there for 9 years. And then, he entered St. John's College at Cambridge University. Wordsworth enjoyed hiking during his stay in Cambridge. He went on a walking tour of France, Switzerland, and Germany. His enthusiasm for French Revolution took him to France. In 1791, he developed passionate sympathies with the cause of French Revolution, thinking it a great movement for the liberation of men from dehumanizing forces. But the most important event of this trip to France was his relationship with Annette Vallum, who bore him an illegitimate daughter, Caroline, in 1792. There is good reason to think that Wordsworth and Annette intended to marry. But their relationship was interrupted by a call that Wordsworth received from his uncles, asking him to return to England immediately. Since Wordsworth was entirely dependent upon them for support, for financial support, he didn't have any choice. Before they called him home to England, Wordsworth had actually made plans to return home to ask their permission for his marriage with Annette. However, any return to France was made impossible by the English declaration of war against France in 1793. The year that followed was a great torture for the poet. Besides all the emotional torture he experienced after leaving Annette and his daughter Caroline behind in France, Wordsworth had not only his failing hopes for the revolution to deal with, but also near exclusion from his family. In 1794, he was reunited with his sister Dorothy Wordsworth, who became his companion, close friend, moral supporter, and housekeeper until her physical and mental decline in the 1830s. In 1795, Wordsworth met SamuelTaylorColeridge, and the three, William Wordsworth, Dorothy Wordsworth, and SamuelTaylorColeridge. The three of them grew very close. The two men met every day, talking about poetry and to plan the LyricalBallads, a collection of poems written by the two in very close collaboration and intended as an experiment in poetry written in the language really used by man, in the natural language of man. LyricalBallads was first published anonymously in 1798, yet it came to be regarded as an inauguration of the English Romantic movement. In the fall 1798, the three friends traveled to Germany, a trip that produced intellectual stimulation for Coleridge, but homesickness for Wordsworth. 1799, in Germany, Wordsworth wrote his lucid poems and began to work on his autobiographical poem. It's a long narrative poem, later published as The Prelude. After their return to England, William Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth settled at this, Dove Cottage in their beloved Lake District again. In 1802, Wordsworth and Dorothy visited France again to see Annette and Caroline. On return to England, Wordsworth married Hutchinson. By 1810, they have 5 children, but their happiness was tempered by the loss at the sea of William's brother John, the alienation from Coleridge in 1810, and also the death of 2 children in 1812. Wordsworth's lyric career began with a descriptive sketches, reached an early climax with LyricalBallads, which was first published in 1798. His powers peaked with Poems in 2 volumes, which was published in 1807. The important later works were well underway. His success with short poems made him more eager to succeed with longer, especially with a longer 3-part philosophical poem containing views on man, nature, and society. During his lifetime, he refused to print the Prelude, which he had completed by 1805, because he thought it was unprecedented for a poet to talk so much about himself. So he spent much of his later life revising the prelude. You can see the manuscripts of his revisions of the poem. Critics will quarrel about which version is better, the 1805 or the 1850, the year he died. But agree that, well, in either case, it is the most successful blank verse epic since Milton's Paradise Lost. In 1813, Wordsworth received an appointment as tributor of stamps for Westmoreland, made £400 per year. And this made him financially secure. The whole family, including his sister Dorothy Wordsworth, the whole family moved to Rydal Mount. It's beside the lake. And finally, fully reconciled to Coleridge, the two of them toured the Rhineland in 1828. Durham University granted him an honorary doctor of civil law degree in 1838, and Oxford University conferred the same honor on him the next year. So when Robert Southey died in 1843, William Wordsworth was appointed poet laureate. Wordsworth died in 1850, and his wife published the much revised prelude that summer. Okay, this is a very brief sketch about the life of William Wordsworth. As I mentioned, LyricalBallads was first published in 1798. 2 years later, in 1800, the second edition of LyricalBallads was published, containing Wordsworth's famous preface, which has been considered as a manifesto of Romanticism and a milestone in the history of lyric criticism. Preface to LyricalBallads. And this preface shifts emphasis from the relationship between poem and reader to the relationship between poet and poem. He considers the poet a teacher not of concepts, but of immediate intuitions of nature. He discusses the idea of a poet, a man speaking to man, a man, it is true, endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul. This is a poet. A man with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm, greater knowledge, and more comprehensive soul than ordinary man, than common man. He defines a poem as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Now, it seems as if, the two parts in this definition is in contradiction to each other, but actually they are not in contradiction. Both parts of this statement are important. The second, I would like to say, modifies the first. Wordsworth makes clear that the poem does not simply rush forth. Memory and contemplation come into play in its composition. Memory and, contemplation come into play in the composition of poetry. Nevertheless, emphasis in the definition is on the dominance of feeling over intellect. And this preface is also well known for Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction, poetic language. He attacks, the popular style of his time as using a gaudy and unnamed phraseology that veils nature rather than reveals the spirit of nature. So Wordsworth advocates that, poets use a language really used by men. And this argument is partly an outgrowth of Wordsworth's own preference for rural over urban life. In his view, simple, concrete language expresses a close relationship to permanent forms of nature, which he associates with the rural speech and rural life. Wordsworth, he defines, and now let's come back to his definition of poetry. Now he defines poem as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion also, says Wordsworth in the preface, the emotion is contemplated till by a species of action the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. Now, this is a very long sentence, but we can pick up, those key elements. Emotion needs to be contemplated till the tranquility disappears gradually. When you contemplate a kind of emotion you experienced in the past, the tranquility will disappear. And emotion, that is a new emotion, kindred to, that is similar to what, you experienced before, is gradually produced. A new emotion is produced and thus exists in your mind. So it is important, therefore, to observe in Wordsworth's full definition that though poetry may begin in tranquility, the original emotion must be contemplated until a new emotion, kindred to, that is similar to the original, exists in the mind. And I say this is the point when complex feelings overflows. And this is also the point the poetic composition begins. Now let me read aloud the poem for you. I wander lonely as a cloud. I wander lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills. When all at once I saw the crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Between the first printing, this poem in 1807, and the version of 1815. Wordsworth made several deliberate improvements. He changed several words, and he added the whole stanza, the second stanza. In fact, the writing of this poem was unspontaneous enough for Wordsworth, because he took line 21 and 22 from Mary, from his wife. So it's likely that the experience of daffodil watching was not entirely Wordsworth's to begin with, but was derived in part from the recollections his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, had set down in her journal. This is a description Dorothy took in her journal. She said, "When we were in the woods beyond Outbury Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. As we went along, there were more, and yet more, and at last, under the boughs of the trees, we saw that, there was a long belt of them along the shore. About the breadth of the country turnpike road, I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon those stones as on a pillow for weariness. The rest tossed and reeled and danced, and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever glancing, ever changing." Now, notice that Wordsworth's poem echoes a few of his sister's observations. Weaving poetry out of their mutual memories, Wordsworth has offered the experience as if altogether his own, made himself lonely. The point is not that Wordsworth is a liar or a plagiarist, but that he has transformed ordinary life into art. So we need not deny that a poet's experience can contribute to a poem, nor that the emotion in a poem can indeed be the poet's. Still, to write a good poem, one needs to do more than live and feel. Writing poetry takes skill and imagination, qualities that simply extensive travel, wide experience do not necessarily give. Emily Dickinson, for example, for much of her life, seldom strayed away from her family's house and grounds in Amherst, Massachusetts. Yet her rhymed line studies of a snake, a bee, a hummingbird remained some of the best poetic presentations we've ever seen. Now let's see how William Wordsworth dramatizes his poetic presentation of his idea about poetry in this poem, I wander lonely as a cloud. I wander lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills. Now look at the opening two lines of this poem. The first image of the poem, I wander lonely as a cloud, immediately establishes both the poet's solitude, being alone by himself, and his connection with the natural world. We see that the poet, the speaker, I, floats on high above the scene, and yet is part of the scene. The lively sound effect of these two perfect iambic tetrameter is not iambic pentameter, it's tetrameter, only 4 feet. Da-dong, 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 da-dong. I wander lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills. So the sound effect reinforces the harmonious relationship between the eye and natural objects. I would like to say humanity and nature. When all at once I saw the crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Hearing these 4 lines, we, the reader, are brought back into a narrative. It seems, well, there is a story in the poem. The poet wanders, well, through a landscape and is struck by the sight of a field of daffodils. But the dancing image of these flowers, we see the fluttering and dancing in the breeze, seems to have echoed back to the lonely eye floating high over vales and hills. So the message here is, even if, the speaker, the message in the first stanza, even if, the speaker, I, human being, is alone by himself in nature, he does not feel lonely. He dances with natural objects. Now, let me quote from one of my beloved professors in Peking University, Professor Luo Jingguo, who just passed away last year. In his textbook, he says Wordsworth's love for nature is boundless. To him, nature seems more than rivers, trees, mountains, lakes, and so on. Nature has a moral value, has its philosophical significance. Nature is for him the embodiment of divine spirit. He believes that God and universe are identical. To Wordsworth, nature is the greatest of all teachers, and those who are uncorrupted by society, especially those simple, rustic people, can communicate directly with nature, which gives them power, peace, and happiness. I will call your attention to the last sentence. To Wordsworth, nature is the greatest of all teachers, and those who are uncorrupted by urban society, especially those simple, rustic people, can communicate directly with nature. This is a very good expression of nature in the context of Romanticism. Okay, second stanza. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched a never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. Here in this second stanza, the daffodils are compared to stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. And these flowers remind the speaker of the stars at night in brightness and multitude, stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay, in brightness and multitude. And the dancing image recurs here in the second stanza, shining, twinkling, tossing. So the dancing image reveals a sense of joy, unity, continuity in the natural elements of air, water, and earth. The third stanza, the waves beside them danced. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. The speaker goes on to compare the flowers here to the sparkling waves, just as he compares the flowers to the stars twinkle shining on the Milky Way. Here the flowers are compared to the sparkling waves of a nearby lake. The image of the sparkling waves not only echoes back to the image of the floating cloud in the first stanza and the shining and twinkling stars in the second stanza, but also introduces a kind of fusion by which, heaven, earth, water are joined in the vision of these dancing daffodils. So in the first, three stanzas, we have, a picture of a kind of fusion by which, heaven, earth, water are joined in the image of those dancing daffodils. Now, we can have some messages here. First, these images convey the qualities of radiance and movement: float, shine, twinkle, sparkle. Together with the repetitions of the word dance, these images create a picture of nature as vital, animated, glowing. Second, the relationship between the poet or the speaker and the landscape, the man and nature, is one of intimate union. Here we see the intimate union of man and nature, suggesting an identity of mood between the subject and object, or we say humanity and nature. Identity of mood. Nature expresses the mood of humanity. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. Third, the experience of seeing. I gazed and gazed, but little thought. It becomes the subject of the poem. The vision and the attendant emotion are what, the poet brings away from the experience. So later, he recreates in memory and imagination the happy, feelings. In the fourth place, the wealth. What wealth the show to me had brought. The wealth suggests a kind of heightened sense of delight. The flowers first brought him. Later in his life, this sweet memory in the past will come back and delight him again and again. At last, the poet develops the vision of the daffodils as the central event, emphasizing the act of seeing, the act of exploring its philosophical significance. Thus, the imagery describing the scene becomes particularly important, for it is through figurative language that Wordsworth explores the relationship between subject and object, between man and nature. Okay, now let's look at the last stanza. For oft on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood. They flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. Then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodil. That inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. In the opening image, we have the image of solitude. The eye, wandered, lonely, as a cloud. And toward the end, the idea of solitude is central to the poem. The image of the poet wandering lonely as a cloud opens the poem and establishes the atmosphere in which the poet's vision occurs. Now, solitude is once again the poet's condition at the end of the poem, as he lies on his couch apart from nature, yet still somehow connected to it, to nature, through the power of imagination. That inward eye, that is imagination. This last stanza as a whole describes the operation of imagination on the fragments of past world experience. A single brief event which occurred in a distant summer landscape has brought the poet permanent wealth in terms of the ability both to recall the visual scene and to recapture the emotional pleasure. So an analogous movement is suggested here within the final stanza by words, vacant and fierce. We see the emptiness of speaker's spirit is transformed into a fullness of feelings as he remembers the daffodils. So this is probably a way the poet recollected emotion he experienced in the past. They flash upon that inward eye. The idea of recurrence is suggested by the word flash. Flash, of course, flash of vision, which is connected with the radiance of the original flowers and by the dancing of the poet's heart, which recalls the animation of the scene. That inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, is the creative imagination. That inward eye is the imagination. It's a human capacity to remember, to reproduce experience. And this creative power, common to all people, is more highly developed in a poet. As we mentioned, poet, has more sensibility, more enthusiasm, more tenderness, and a more comprehensive soul. So poet composes poems out of emotion, recollected in tranquility. In other words, through that inward eye of memory and imagination, other moods of loneliness, listlessness can be animated with the sense of fulfillment which was captured on that distant summer landscape. So the poem is an intensely personal one. It communicates purely subjective experience, but it suggests something else, something about himself and something about every one of us. So it's a personal experience, but it communicates universal experience. And this is the way William Wordsworth dramatized his poetic presentation of his ideas about poetry. Okay, now let's look at the assignments. Similarly, you are expected to recite the poem when we meet next time, and write a journal about your understanding of Wordsworth's definition of poetry. And next time when we meet, we'll talk about John Keats' sonnet. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, try to discuss the logical or thematic structure of Keats' sonnet. We've learned Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, Milton's Sonnet 19, and we'll discuss Keats' sonnet next time when we meet. Thank you very much.